Hey folks, I'm Brown Bear. Today is the first in a multi-part in-depth design commentary series on Banjo-Kazooie. I'll be playing through the entire game and talking about a bunch of different things as we go along. Game design, level design, world building, art style, anything and everything about the game. I recommend that you watch these videos from beginning to end. However, for the convenience of folks who prefer to jump around, I've provided timestamps to major talking points in the description below. Before we get started, the first thing worth discussing is the choice of platform. If you're a purist like me, there's no substitute for the original gameplay on the Nintendo 64. That's the intended experience, and therefore exactly the right place to conduct this kind of in-depth commentary. Case closed, right? Well, I also believe in the idea that format and content should synergize. I write a blog on real-time strategy games because those kinds of games require an information density that's usually best suited to the written form. I dislike so-called cinematic experiences in games because computer games and films are different mediums with different goals. Videos on game design follow the same philosophy. While I'd recommend the original version to anyone looking to play the most authentic banjo experience possible, there's no denying that watching 1080p at silky smooth 60 frames per second will feel better than 640 by 480. I wanted to get this right, so here's what I did. I 100%ed the game on both platforms, the original Nintendo 64 version and the modern HD remake. I took careful notes, particularly around differences between the two versions, researched and wrote the script for this series, made a decision around target platform, and finally 100%ed the game a third time to get the exact right footage. As you can see, I picked the HD version. Aside from the practical reasons I cited previously, the remake also aligns more closely with how I remember the game when I first played it. This might seem surprising, but back in the 90s these graphics looked really good, especially in comparison with the 16-bit Super Nintendo. I really love this game, and I want to make sure I present it in the right way. The younger generation that perhaps only played the remake might not be able to appreciate the older graphics, simply because they didn't grow up in that time. From a gameplay perspective, I was also relieved to discover that the modern version is extremely faithful to the original game. Anytime there's a difference from the Nintendo 64 version, we'll always assume original gameplay. That means no persistence of notes across world entries and exits, and no revamped stop and swap mechanics. The impact of draw distance on the effectiveness of the level design is unfortunately unavoidable. The bright side is that this brings up some interesting ideas, so we'll be talking about it as we go along. Without further ado, let's get into this game. Now typically, you'd expect us to start at the very beginning, with the title's Introductory cinematic, but actually I think it makes sense to go back even further. Banjo-Kazooie was released in 1998 for the Nintendo 64. Back then, many players' first and sometimes only impression of a game was its box art. To some extent this is still true, but not nearly to the degree that it was back then. One of the things Lair, the developers of Banjo, consistently did well in that era was world building, appealing to the player's imagination to convey a sense of wonder that the pure mechanics might not otherwise suggest. With Banjo, they started this process from the moment the player's eyes land on the box. The world looks inviting and interesting to explore, Banjo is carrying one thing while chasing another, a bunch of different characters are introduced, the water and stars are sparkling brightly in the background, and so on. Rare made a key decision right from the get-go to showcase the entire package rather than focus on the protagonists. Not only is this great from a world-building perspective, it's also the kind of conservative approach that makes sense given that there would always be some risk associated with new intellectual property. This philosophy extends into the opening cinematic. In less than 4 minutes, it touches on all of the major characters. Honestly, the biggest surprise about this is that it exists at all. The Banjo team came from Donkey Kong Country and Donkey Kong Country 2, titles that featured almost no direct narrative. Banjo's shift toward a stronger narrative arc was pretty substantial. A story cinematic plays not only at the beginning of the game, but also upon the player's first entry to Grunty's lair and every time the player quits the game. I think it was important to the Banjo team to set a consistent emotional tone right from the beginning of the game and make it very clear to players what to expect from the title. The box art, a track screen, and opening cinematic all highlight an irreverent emotional tone, an adventure into exotic lands, and puzzle solving. First impressions matter, especially with new IP, especially in an era when game rentals were very popular. And within the first 5 minutes of the game, it's very clear that you're playing something a lot more special than a Mario 64 clone. Probably the only unusual aspect of this introduction is the fact that Bottles and Banjo don't seem to know who the other is. It was actually at this moment that I started to think the HD version would be usable. If they were willing to remake such a jarring and unexpected interaction, they had probably created a pretty faithful reproduction. Even though we already know what we're doing, we're going to go ahead and do the tutorial anyway. There's a surprising amount of stuff happening while we're busy learning the game's basic controls. My favorite part about this section is its environmental immersion. Right from the start you get to experience some pretty brilliant level design. On the one hand, it's really bright and open, and on the other hand, as long as you can see a location, you can actually go to it. This has the effect of making the world seem a lot bigger and brighter than it actually is, since your brain is less likely to subconsciously write off background information as visual noise. In fact, I think anyone who's played these games can attest to how powerfully they pull you into the experience, making them seem much larger than they are in reality. The writing is a big contributor to this sense of immersion, especially here at the start. It gives us a much better feel for who Banjo and Kazooie really are. By the time we've completed all 6 tutorials, we feel a lot more invested into the protagonists. The competition between Banjo and Kazooie to get the most moves makes them feel like real characters rather than just props. I especially liked how the designers used extra honeycombs to smooth out the transition between the text-heavy dialogue and regular gameplay. This also has the effect of reinforcing the lessons the player has already learned, making it less likely that they'll forget something important later on. The 6th honeycomb is especially genius. It's essentially impossible to miss, it forces the player to use several different new skills, and it's not required, meaning the player will feel like they've discovered something cool just by finding it. It makes the player feel like they spent their time wisely by going through this initial tutorial section. This whole tutorial manages to do so much with so little time. It's honestly the perfect way to start the game, and one of the few tutorials I consistently do when I go back and replay titles. Before we make our way into Grunty's lair, there's a couple other things I want to touch on. One is that Banjo's core moveset, in contrast with a game like Super Mario 64, is very role-oriented. It's less about encouraging individual style, there's much less redundancy. Instead, platforming is segment-based and focused on solving specific obstacles, more similar to Donkey Kong Country. I mention this primarily because Banjo is a much slower and more thoughtful title than most collectible platformers, and I think the core moveset is a big part of that. For me personally, the emphasis on puzzles and world building was one of the biggest appeals of the title. It's not a pure platformer by any means. I think this is one of the reasons the developers opted to include an explicit recovery move separate from its attacking corollary. I also want to underscore how little emphasis is placed on combat, which is neither the focus nor one of the core competencies of this title. Enemies exist largely to keep things interesting and act as environmental hazards. If we take a look at the pre-production specification of Banjo's moveset, we'll notice how the majority of moves that got cut were related to combat. The developers clearly considered and rejected the notion of a more combat-heavy experience, preferring to emphasize the puzzle-solving gameplay that we see today. With the tutorial out of the way, I think we're now ready to enter Grunty's lair. Fortunately for us, Bottles has managed to fix the bridge. After another quick cutscene, we can now start the game proper. To our left, we'll grab the game's first Jiggy. It's a small detail, but the fact that the game's primary collectible has a tangible purpose makes it feel more meaningful to collect, something that we'll be able to better appreciate later on. Aside from this, there's really not much to do, so we'll head straight over to Mumbo's Mountain. Mumbo's Mountain is a pretty great first world, and acts as a kind of second introduction for players trying to get a feel for the game. One of the first things we notice is how little concrete direction the game gives us. All it says is how many new moves there are. That means the player is encouraged to explore the level in its entirety rather than focus on one particular area. It also means the player will assume that any area that can be seen can probably be visited. That puts a big responsibility on the level designer to ensure the entire level is a compelling experience, since there's no implied order in how areas are tackled. This is especially important given that it's the game's first world. A lot of players are probably still forming their first impression. This approach implies that a well-designed level will feature no wasted space. Every nook and cranny should offer an interesting and rewarding experience. A good friend Conga offers a great case study in how this plays out. The player is made aware of a few points of interest: a monkey throwing fruit, and some buttons on the ground with oranges painted on them. Conga complains that the player is touching the buttons, so the player thinks it might be interesting to see what happens if a fruit lands on them. When it does, they hear a pleasant sound. That pushes them to do the same for the other 2 buttons, and a Jiggy is given as a reward. The game doesn't tell you any of this directly. Instead, it simply uses smart level design and some witty writing. The message to players is pretty simple. If you see something interesting, check it out. If something should work a certain way, it probably does work that way. The level design is self-explanatory and intuitive. It needs to be inherently compelling because the player is never given any direct instructions. Virtually every collectible in the game works this way. In fact, the implication of this design approach is that simply exploring the level in its entirety guarantees finding all of its collectibles. It's not a collectathon so much as it is a puzzle-solving adventure that rewards exploration with collectible items. That makes perfect sense if you've played this game before, but it's surprisingly unintuitive to folks who don't play collectible platformers, or at least haven't played this one. Mumbo's Mountain contains 3 moves, the most of any world in Banjo. It's also the only world whose moves are core mechanics. Both the Talon Trot and Beak Buster are part of Banjo's fundamental moveset. They're straight up upgrades to the character rather than simply unlocking the ability to use an item. I can't say for sure why Rare didn't simply include these in the introductory tutorial, but my suspicion with the Talon Trot specifically is that they wanted players to see it as a tool rather than a faster way of moving around. If they had introduced it from the beginning, players might have perceived it as similar to a run function and therefore used it constantly. That doesn't really align with the slower and more methodical pacing the levels are designed for, so I think a lot of players would have gotten unnecessarily frustrated with the controls as a result. Mumbo's Mountain alleviates that concern by serving as a sort of playground for players to integrate everything they've learned into a working mental model. It's the only world in the game where it's practically impossible to die from fall damage. It's also the only world that lacks a constant, damage-dealing environmental hazard. One of the things you're going to keep an eye on as we move through the game is the way the level design progresses with regard to these 2 factors. More to the point, the brilliance with which the gently sloping difficulty curve keeps the player engaged, but never makes the game feel too difficult. On our way out, we'll make sure to find all the Mumbo tokens so that we can access the termite transformation. Mumbo's Mountain is the only level that requires the player to find every token, at least if you want to complete the levels in order. I'm not sure if this was intentional, but for me it always had the effect of making the tokens seem a lot more important than they really were. I always feel really happy when I find one, even though by the end of the game you discover that about a third of them were completely optional. While we head out to collect the last Jiggy, you might be thinking that I've forgotten to talk about a lot of stuff. Indeed, I haven't even touched on Jingjoes, extra honeycombs, the transformation mechanic, the Grunty switch, and so on. If I talked about every mechanic that this world introduced, this commentary series would probably be 50% Mumbo's Mountain. You can rest assured that I'll be talking about all this stuff as we go along, but I've saved topics for the worlds that make the most sense for them. Now that we have the Talon Trot, we can proceed into the rest of Grunty's Lair. Here we start to see the beginning of a consistent pattern in Rare's world building. When we first entered Grunty's Lair, we saw a path that we couldn't traverse, so we went into Mumbo's Mountain instead. We kept that in the back of our minds as something to do later. The moment we unlocked the Talon Trot, we felt excited, because we remembered that we could go back and explore something new. Now that this path is accessible, we get our reward, a brand new world. In addition, we see a shock spring jump that we can't use, a world we can't enter, a note door that's out of reach, a picture without a Jiggy platform, an NPC that seems useless on the surface, and 2 cauldrons that tell us we can't use them yet. The pattern is thus established. We know that by continuing to play the game, we'll unlock the tools we need to explore these new areas. We look forward to it, we anticipate it. It's incredibly engaging and keeps us fully immersed in the gameplay experience. Playing the game only wants to make us play it even more. I almost can't put into words how critical this loop is to the Banjo experience. It's the reason this hub world is so effective. It constantly reinforces a sense of progression and achievement while gently reminding the player that there's even more to find. You end up remembering every nook and cranny because the title's strong level design gives you good reason to. Grunty's Lair becomes more than just a hub world, it almost feels like home. There's a sense of familiarity, a sense of intimacy. You look forward to coming back and seeing what more there is to discover. As excited as we are to unlock all this stuff, there's not actually much we can do at this point. After dropping a few Jiggies into the next painting, we're ready to enter Treasure Trove Cove. Treasure Trove Cove is a huge increase in complexity over Mumbo's Mountain. It's substantially larger and features multiple branching paths, each with a decent amount more going on than the game's first world. We'll start things off by chatting with Nipper, who's unfortunately feeling quite disagreeable today. While we're busy dealing with him, we can take a look at the original sketches for this world. Of particular interest here is the way the artist frames the level front to back, almost in two-dimensional terms. It's worth noting that the original concept behind Banjo envisioned a fixed camera angle overseeing a 2.5-dimensional perspective rather than full-blown 3D, somewhere in between Donkey Kong Country and Super Mario 64. I'm guessing that's why the artist chose to frame the original design this way. If you look at the date on this drawing, it was done very early in development. I think if you sat down with someone who's only played the final product and asked them to draw a map of Treasure Trove Cove, they would naturally pick a top-down view. That's just what makes the most sense, and it's the easiest way to convey a central mountain surrounded by an encircling beach. If you look at diagrams for later levels in the game, or in levels found in Banjo-Tooie, that's exactly how they're done. Probably the biggest surprise from this is that the final level design still ended up almost identical to this drawing. We'll discuss why that is in later levels, but in summary, the freedom of movement for Banjo's camera is actually fairly limited. While the game is definitely fully 3D, the intended experience often depends on the player trusting the default point of view, which aligns more with the fixed camera philosophy that this drawing stems from. One of my biggest surprises on the Nintendo 64 playthrough was how rarely I used the C buttons to adjust the camera. It was usually either behind the shoulder or default. While we were busy looking at sketches, our crab friend's been defeated, so we've grabbed our first Jiggy. We're not going to head over to talk to our old friend Captain Blubber. The Captain makes an appearance in all the Banjo games, and with good reason. One of the things we discussed earlier is how Banjo-Kazooie's opening emphasizes the entire package over just the protagonists. It takes its time building player attachment to Banjo and Kazooie, knowing that it's new intellectual property that players aren't familiar with. When the cover art of Banjo-Tooie emphasizes the protagonists and nothing else, it's because of the work the team for Banjo-Kazooie did, showing players that these are characters worth caring about. The same can be said for the Captain. The developers never take for granted the idea that players will want to see more of him. His blubbering sound effect is endearing, the writing spot on, and the guy even gives you a Jiggy for helping him out. In other words, they do the foundational work necessary to establish a lovable character in their franchise. Down the road, this enables them to make callbacks that can be used in marketing to draw in longtime fans. This might seem like a minor point, but for me personally it's a big reason why Rare franchises are so close to my heart. The developers never abuse the player's sense of nostalgia. They treat their audience with respect and only make references to things that players actually like. Callbacks feel like fun. They feel like a pat on the back for being a fan. They don't feel cheap. Being a fan of a mass-market consumer product is always a tricky balance, but I never felt that way with Rare, at least back in the 90s. We've managed to find Captain Blubber's treasure, so it's time to learn how to fly. The same way Mumbo's mountain acts as a sandbox for players to learn the core mechanics, Treasure Trove Cove provides a safe and big area to learn how to fly. Very little depends on the player flying well. This allows them to take their time and become comfortable with the mechanics. This is important because this is the first point in the game that truly leverages vertical space. Up until now, players could rely on the strong camera angles to play the equivalent of a 2.5-dimensional game. By contrast, flying is a full-blown 3D experience, so it's more important that the developers give players time to become accustomed to this. The spring jump disc falls into this category as well. These raised pillars really push the envelope in teaching the player how to reconcile their vertical and side-to-side positions simultaneously. It's not just the player who is learning something new. The level designers themselves were also learning the ins and outs of building a proper 3-dimensional experience, and it's here where draw distance starts to become an interesting consideration. Any land-based segment can get away with fairly poor draw distance, especially in a platformer. The player is busy dealing with environmental hazards and moving from point A to point B. As long as they can see the area around them, the game engine has done its job. Flying, and vertical space more generally, change the equation. The player has nothing else to do except to look around, in any direction, at any time. This means they'll start to wonder why they can't see faraway items until they get up close. Consider the Cove's extra honeycombs as a case study. The game design here is pretty straightforward. The developers wanted to cultivate a desire to explore. Putting an extra honeycomb on a box out on the ocean is a great way to do this, and it rewards players who thought it prudent to explore the level in its entirety, including the ocean. The modern remake removes this sense of discovery by upping the draw distance to basically infinity. On the flip side, it makes the experience of flying far more seamless because things don't randomly pop in. I'd argue that both the original and the remake made the correct choices here. The developers of the original found depth within the limitations of their own game engine, whereas the remake fully utilizes modern hardware. In other words, I think this kind of segment simply wouldn't work if included in a game released today. The level designer would likely need to obfuscate the item using some rocks or other natural scenery to compensate for the strong draw distance. The last thing we'll talk about here is Snacker. Snacker is essentially an environmental hazard with training wheels. The player has some time to recover if they fall in the water instead of losing health points immediately. He exists in order to drive player behavior in a certain direction, in this case, learning how to platform accurately. I like this a lot because it's great obfuscation. The game needs to teach the player how to platform properly so that they can truly enjoy the rest of the game. But the player isn't here to learn, they're here to explore and have a great time. Snacker forces the player to do this without feeling like a chore. In fact, more than anything, he contributes to the player's sense of immersion. It's really smart level design, and little else is capable of bringing me back into the banjo mindset like the Snacker theme song. With the Cove wrapped up, it's back to Grunty's Lair to collect our eagerly anticipated rewards. We've gone on about 20 minutes so far, so I think this is a good time to stop. Next time, we'll be heading into Clanker's Cavern. Thanks for watching! If you enjoyed this video, please follow me here or on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.